Thanks so much, Dimitri, for that introduction. Tony, I'm definitely booking you for lunch. You must be cautious about trying to recolonize Africa with our ideas of what an African city looks like. But I won't go any further than that. Good morning, everyone. I think it's incredibly significant that we gather here today to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Stern Review, and our first substantive session is focused on cities. And the previous speakers have really indicated why cities are so important. I am going to belabor some of those points because I think, as Tony said, some of these statistics bear repeating, because much of this debate at the global level has been urban blind until now. And so I think it's really unavoidable that we land in a place where we have to talk about cities, because we live on a planet of cities now. To borrow a term from Shlomo Angel, cities effectively dominate the development agenda. They dominate the global environmental change agenda. If you think about it, cities are only responsible for 2% of total land cover, and yet here comes some of these repeated statistics. They're responsible for 70% of the global economy, 70% of global waste, 70% of greenhouse gas emissions, 60% of global energy consumption. And therefore, it's not surprising that that new urban agenda, that pathway for urbanization over the next 2 decades, really highlights that cities are going to play a critical role in tackling the changes of sustainable development. That new agenda was adopted at Habitat 3 in Quito in Ecuador last week, and it underscores the fact that urbanization is one of the most important and transformative trends, and Nick has really picked up on that in his input early this morning. But the future, so the growth and development opportunities in these cities that we're looking to basically save the world, are going to be very strongly influenced by the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And you've seen this diagram in front of you this morning. Now, the one thing it is it's incredibly colorful. The one thing it isn't is very helpful, because what it does is suggest that each of these sustainable development goals is unique, it's discrete, it's unrelated to the others. It belies the deep interdependence of the 17 sustainable development goals. And therefore, I far prefer this one, which is referred to fondly as the wedding cake, produced by the Stockholm Resilience Center, which talks to us about the strong systemic relationship which exists between these three systems of economy, society, and biosphere. It talks to us about an economy that's in service to society, not the other way around, that enables society to work within the safe operating space of the planet. And if we adopt this conceptualization of sustainable development, then cities offer us a very important geography. They offer us a local geography where these three systems come together in an integrated and very intimate manner. And therefore, it's not surprising that once the discussions began at the global level about what are we going to do after the MDGs come to a natural conclusion, it was underscored that right from the beginning that any new agenda would have to be relevant at the urban level. It would have to be relevant to urban dwellers, because it's simply going to mark the battleground. Cities will be the battleground where the challenge for sustainable development will either be met or will be lost. That's acknowledged in the fact that one of those 17 is a dedicated goal for cities, SDG 11. Those of us in the urban environment regard that as a particularly important achievement that came out of September 2015. And it's about making cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. But just as cities are central to the Sustainable Development Agenda, they're equally central to the climate change agenda. And here I'm repeating some of the statistics of earlier this morning. They're responsible for over 70% of global fossil fuel carbon dioxide emissions and are vulnerable hotspots in terms of climate impact. And so when we look to the climate or the Paris decision, which supports the Paris Agreement, it identifies that there are a number of important non-party stakeholders who are key actors in terms of the overall global climate change response, and really picks up on cities and subnational authorities as being particularly important players in that space. The The new urban agenda, fresh, hot off the press out of Quito last week, also identifies that cities, their inhabitants, their local stakeholders are going to play a critical role in implementing this global climate change response. And again, the reason for this is quite simple. We've heard this repeated this morning. That's simply because urban centres concentrate people and assets. We've got about 3.9 billion people living in our cities today. That's going to increase by 2.5 by 2050. And as other people have indicated, the important part of this growth is it's focused largely in the cities of Asia and in Africa. And as I've mentioned before, we should not anticipate that those cities are going to look anything like London or the cities of the global north. Most of the world's economy and assets are focused in cities. McKinsey did that piece of work which highlighted that 600 cities account for about 60% of the world's GDP. And it's simple logic. If you put this number of people and that amount of assets into one geography, they're going to be at risk from climate change. So any change in flooding, drought, extreme heat, changes in precipitation are going to mean impacts and losses for cities in terms of food security, human health, and infrastructural impacts. And so if we're concerned about reducing vulnerability and exposure, which we must surely be if we're interested in growth and development in the 21st century, then urban areas are really where the climate change rubber hits the road in a very real way. And we can see the scale of that problem if we look at these two maps. This is a depiction of cities with over 750,000 inhabitants in 1950. And if we project forward but a decade from where we are today, we can see that change at the global level. This really indicates that we're living through the most rapid period of urbanization in our species' history, and we can see that strong focus emerging in Asia and in Africa, something we need to pay attention to. And so as cities have become more central to the development debate, the sustainable development debate, climate change, so the scientists have become more interested in cities. And we certainly saw that in the fifth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in the last assessment cycle, where we saw a much stronger urban focus. We had dedicated urban chapters in Working Group 2 on adaptation, and in Working Group 3 on planning and mitigation in cities. I'm not going to talk to mitigation because, as I predicted, prior speakers will deal with low carbon. Very few people actually talk about adaptation. So I'm going to focus on the adaptation aspects of the IPCC's assessment in the last cycle. Particularly important in terms of the chapter that was produced for Working Group 2 on cities was the very strong link made between adaptation and development. And the reason for that link, again, is quite simple. It's because underdevelopment makes cities vulnerable, regardless of the sort of risk that they're facing, be that climate risk, economic risk, societal risk. And currently, as previous speakers have pointed out, we have very large development and infrastructure deficits in cities around the world. And that's because the majority of the world's urban population lives in low and middle income developing countries. But we also have a very large adaptation deficit, not only because of the lack of conventional infrastructure, because of the substantial loss of ecological infrastructure that we're experiencing in our cities. And Nick touched on that important point during the course of his presentation. It's a point that often goes or is lost in the bigger debate around low-carbon cities, the importance of viable and important ecosystems as a critical part of our urban areas. We have 1 billion people living in informal settlements, so 1 out of every 7 people on the face of the globe live in these difficult and trying circumstances. But just as those things pose an enormous global challenge, and we've heard that underlined on several occasions today, they also offer us a unique global opportunity. And again, we've heard the fact that we're going to double our investment in terms of urban infrastructure spend over the next decade or so, with the majority of that investment occurring in urban centres of the emerging economies. And just to give a sense of the scale of that build, and in fact, Tony touched on that in his presentation, the Brookings Institute observes that half of what will be the built environment of 2030 simply does not exist today. So this is a massive piece of human endeavor that needs to be harnessed to achieve the kind of world that Nick was creating a vision of this morning. But at the same time, we mustn't overlook the opportunities that exist in the cities of the global north, cities like London, where there's aging infrastructure. There's a real opportunity to look at that replacement in a climate-smart way and harness that opportunity as well. The problem is, given the nature of the global economy, given the unequal distribution of resources around the globe, is cities have a very different ability to harness this adaptation dividend simply because of a lack of resources. And this graph points out quite clearly the difference. So we can see cities from Africa in the top bars and their limited resource base compared, for example, to cities in the US, have a much greater resource base to call on if they're talking about putting in place climate-smart infrastructure. And so what the urban chapter of Working Group 2 in the Fifth Assessment Report identifies is that if we look across the globe, we've got a huge spectrum of urban adaptive capacity in the world's cities. So at the low end of the spectrum, there are those cities with very little adaptive capacity, where a very low percentage of the urban residents are served by basic services and risk-reducing infrastructure, and that's paired up with very little or no investment capacity at the local level. At the more aspirational end of our spectrum, we have something we refer to as transformative adaptation. So this is a world in which we find cities where the development agenda and the adaptation agenda are integrated, where we've got ambitious mitigation, where we're working towards reducing the ecological footprint of our cities, where the bulk of the population are serviced by basic services and risk-reducing infrastructure, and where there's still substantial investment capacity to take those cities forward. And so really in that sort of world, we have the potential to get to some of these root causes of poverty, to tackle the failures of sustainable development, make rapid progress on mitigation, so to fundamentally change the attributes of our urban systems. The problem is when we look to the world's cities and look at the distribution across that spectrum, we can't find a single city which we would regard as transformed, which meets all of these challenges. So we can see some bright sparks, some improvements in infrastructure provision, some changes in governance, some more innovative approaches to resource mobilization, but we can't find a city that we would regard as totally transformed from an adaptation point of view. So the big question is, how do we begin moving, bumping cities along that particular spectrum? Well, obviously that's going to require more effective climate change adaptation. And how do we get there? It's effectively going to require us to begin to integrate the four big urban agendas: poverty reduction and the provision of services, obviously top of mind for any city around the world; disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and climate change mitigation. So the idea is we need to focus on a process of integrated decision-making in our cities, which is going to generate the multiple benefits from tying these agendas together, but also manage the necessary trade-offs that exist between them. If we look at these agendas and the way they relate to each other, certainly in terms of three of them, there's a natural overlap between them, particularly in the cities of the low-income and lower-middle-income development nations. If you've got high levels of poverty, investing in basic services is obviously going to help you with poverty reduction and providing decent services and quality of life to residents, but it's also going to give you an ability to deal with adaptation needs and disaster risk reduction. So if you put in stormwater drains, it's a basic service, but allows you to adapt to changing climate and changing patterns of precipitation, and gives you an ability to manage risk. And there's a real overlap between these agendas in these cities of the low-income countries, simply because they deal with local impacts that are current. And that's what's top of mind for people and decision makers in those particular cities. When we look to the climate change mitigation agenda, there's far less of an overlap in those senses, because your investment in this particular agenda only reveals its values over time. It's about tackling global risk, not necessarily local risk. And the most severe impacts are going to be revealed through time. They're not necessarily immediate. But the problem is we need to have a better integration of these agendas if we're serious about that transformative adaptation. Just to give you a sense of how these agendas relate on the ground. Here, I'm a local government official, so I like practical things that I can see. I'll give you a case study from the city in which I live and work, Durban in South Africa. We have a very large community reforestation project around one of our sanitary landfill sites, where essentially local community members, largely women and youth, earn sustainable livelihoods from growing the trees that grow into the reforestation project. Because this 700-hectare forest is going around a landfill site, it helps us improve our water supply, so any escaped leachate hits this large vegetated buffer. We're also maintaining wetlands and revegetating riverine areas. That helps us with flood production or reduction in that catchment. And over the longer term, as those saplings going into the ground grow up into a forest, we will get the carbon storage value, which we're using to offset, ironically, the carbon footprint of the soccer or football World Cup, which is held in our city. So I'm still paying the carbon price that Seb Blatter left behind him. But if we're talking about transformative adaptation, we've got to pull these agendas more tightly together. And we acknowledge from a scientific point of view, and again, this has been underscored, that no matter how good your adaptation is, dangerous climate change is going to have a profound impact on all of these three critical local agendas. At some point, you're going to hit a point where even your best adaptation is not going to be able to reduce risk sufficiently unless you've partnered that with ambitious mitigation. And that's really what we talk about in that fifth assessment report as transformative adaptation, the ability to meld these genders effectively together. The importance of doing this, if we're interested in growth and development, has really been underscored by UNEP's very recent report, which looks at the adaptation finance gap. And that shows us that if we look at adaptation costs over the century, they're likely to escalate, to be 2 to 3 times higher by 2030, 4 to 5 times higher by 2050. If we consider the estimates of what it will take to deal with the adaptation needs in the developing world alone, those generally range somewhere between 70 billion and 100 billion per annum. So that means if we take those factors of increase, that we could be sitting with a price tag of about 500 billion per annum by 2050 if we don't deal with adaptation needs appropriately through ambitious mitigation. And as previous speakers have indicated, that really takes us back to the need for enhanced mitigation ambition and pre-2020 action. But we've got to consider the negative feedbacks in this loop. We all know that in Paris we agreed to a temperature target of well below 2 degrees Celsius, but now we're talking about 1.5. We know that an invitation went from the United Nations Framework Convention to the IPCC to investigate what 1.5 might mean. That report is due out in 2018 in time for the facilitated dialogue. But already there are talks around, well, what kind of impacts would this aggressive mitigation action have? Could it have the potential to undermine our adaptive capacity? So if we're talking about things like BECCS, bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, is that a route perhaps to undermine Africa's food security? We're so busy producing bioenergy that we undermine food security in poorest nations. So there are a lot of difficult potential trade-offs in that mix. This is a word cloud I put together quickly last night, taking the outline of the 1.5 report, which the IPCC has just approved at its panel meeting last week in Bangkok. And you can see these themes are very current within the outline of that report. These big agendas of mitigation, adaptation, development, response to risk, poverty, cities are all central to this debate around 1.5. And so as cities move into the center stage of the climate change sustainable development debate, we're beginning to see the IPCC focus more intently on cities. So science is going to become a serious player in this. At the 43rd panel meeting in Nairobi earlier this year, the IPCC agreed that during the 6th assessment cycle, the one that we're in, that we're going to have a much stronger focus on cities, the impacts of climate change on cities, their unique adaptation and mitigation opportunities, that the AR7 cycle, so the next one will include a special report on cities and climate change, and that early in this cycle we should consider a scientific conference on cities and climate change. And I'm pleased to say that was approved in Bangkok at the 44th panel meeting just last week. So the question is, if cities are so important, they offer us all of these opportunities, who's going to do the heavy lifting? Who's actually going to leave hallowed halls like these and go out and get into the trenches and do the dirty work? Fortunately, it's going to be us local government officials. We're going to be responsible for planning, managing, and delivering much of the kind of transformative adaptation that's needed. And the reason for this is that local government has a unique policy competence. It engages directly with local stakeholders. It can tap into and influence both private and household investment. There are economies of scale in the work that we do, and we're capable of integrating land use and infrastructure planning to address adaptation and mitigation needs in a pro-poor and ecologically sustainable manner. The problem is we don't have the right levers or resources to get the job done properly. And that's an important consideration because remember, for us at the local level, climate change is not the only game in town. It's one of a growing list of things that are filtering down to local governments to deliver on. And so the ability and need to capacitate local governments to pick up on these multiple agendas and to align them is now becoming critical. So what do we need to ensure effective risk governance coming through local governments? Well, they need appropriate mandates. All too often we hit the resource or policy glass ceilings that are created by misdirected national policy and poor flows of financial resources. We need local powers for good planning and managing land use change. We need to see more effective alignment across all scales of policy, local to international. Local government needs access to locally relevant, timely climate data and assessment tools, so there's a real job for the IPCC there. We need to be able to learn to recognize and work with uncertainty. We need to pull in the ability to have iterative decision-making and monitoring and to design for continuous learning, because I think, as previous speakers have pointed out, change is the only constant out there now. And leadership really matters. We need to be creating local leaders. And so if we're serious about the conversation that Nick convened us around here today, really looking for those big growth and development opportunities that also allow us to tackle the climate change challenge in an ambitious way, then many of the answers are going to, in fact, lie in the world's cities. So the question is, how do we reimagine the cities of Asia and Africa to harness this potential? Because I can tell you, they are not going to look like London. We're going to have to embrace informality and not try and get rid of it. We're going to have to engage with the strong rural links of African cities. That's just the way Africa is. How do we reform international processes to give cities a real place at the table? On the 1st of January, we see the coming together of the old Compact of Mayors and the European Covenant of Mayors into a powerful local government grouping. How do we put them at the international table in a real way? How do we get resources directly to local governments? Because the transaction costs of getting that money through international processes and national governments are extremely high for us and quite off-putting. How do we ensure that climate science is produced at a scale that cities can access and use? And how do we mobilize local stakeholders and leaders to play their role in this very important 21st century challenge? Thanks very much.
Wow, thank you, Debra, and thank you so much for actually coming in ahead of time, which, given that we were running a little bit late, is incredibly helpful. I thought that was a fascinating tour of the importance of aligning multiple agendas in order to bring about transformative adaptation. So we've technically got 2 minutes till lunch, but I would like to take certainly a round of 3 questions, if I may, from the floor. So there's a lady over here, a gentleman over there. Anyone at the back? If not, there's a gentleman just over here.
Vicky Morgan from the from the UK Collaborative on Development Sciences. It was great to see the glimpse of a bit of green infrastructure in practice in Durban, but a lot of the green infrastructure that cities rely on, it's like the analogy of the footprint thing. A lot of it's outside the city's jurisdiction in the watersheds and the soft coasts. What are the solutions for cities to actually be able to manage their own the ecosystems that they actually rely on, that they don't have actual control over?
Somebody over there, yeah.
If you read prominent climate scientists like Jim Hansen, he's talking about ice melt from Antarctica doubling. I'm not sure if it's every 10 or 20 years, but rapid sea rise by the end of the century. You didn't really say anything much about. Is it 2 or 3 billion people live on coastal cities? Adaptation to rising seas and plans for moving inland. I mean, that bit of missing for me. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Gilberto Arias. I'm with the Energy Network. I have a question. Basically, a lot of times I've been studying how we define mitigation and adaptation, and largely I found there to be an awful lot of overlap between those two, particularly when you get to cities levels and things on the ground. I'm worried about putting mitigation as a secondary or a separate target, because if we adapt before mitigating, our costs will generally go up. I just was wondering if you could comment about the overlap. Thank you.
Okay, so 3 great questions. We've got low carbon infrastructure, scope and jurisdiction. We've got sea level rise in coastal cities, and we've got the integration of mitigation and adaptation, which, as I understood, was part of transformative adaptation.
Correct. Super, thanks for those questions. Firstly, starting off with the green infrastructure. Absolutely, which is why we've got to stop thinking about cities and think about city regions. So in order to manage the landscapes that are vital to resilient and sustainable cities, it requires new partnerships and changes in governance. And I think, that's a word that I haven't heard used here as frequently as it needs to be, because changes in governance are going to be critical to give us the jurisdiction to begin to manage the catchment areas. Looking at the city I live and work in, Durban, we've got precisely that. So we're literally a coastal city at the end of the pipe. Our big natural assets lie in municipalities around us. So we're now forging new patterns of governance to create partnerships between all the local authorities that are critical in those areas so that we can jointly plan. But again, that begins to challenge sort of national edicts and so on. So there are big changes in governance that are necessary to give us access to those resources. Absolutely. I mean, the majority of cities lie in coastal areas, and this is one of the big challenges. And I'm happy to say, in anticipation of our scoping meeting in Monaco at the end of this year, that we're hoping that this will be a big theme that the IPCC looks at in its special report on oceans and cryosphere, really taking that challenge, that critical interface between the human and social and these big ecosystems in that coastal zone to reflect on what it means for coastal cities. How do we adapt? Do we have planned retreat? How much of the assets in the coastal zone become stranded? No one's given a face to that, and we're hoping that will be a place where we can surface what I think you correctly highlight as an important missing element in this debate. So there's a lot of work that's still to be done. And then coming back to the integration of mitigation and adaptation, absolutely. At the local government level, quite frankly, we don't even use those words because we've got no choice. We simply have to do both things together. The problem is, and you can see it in this very gathering today, when you come to the international level, we constantly talk about mitigation and low carbon. And the kind of pressures that we're experiencing at the local level, particularly in the cities of the global south, mean that vulnerability is high on the development agenda. And so there is a shifting in priority. Somehow we have to find ways of pulling those things together by emphasizing both. It's no longer a choice, an A or B. In fact, you have to have both. And the question is, how do we make room for both?